Welcome back to the TM Podcast. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the serial killer, Dr. Death, or Harold Shipman. But first, I'd like to thank everyone for their support on last week's paranormal episode. I plan on alternating between that and true crime as much as possible. It's good to change things up a little every now and then. So, Harold Frederick Shipman was born January 14th, 1946 in Nottingham, England. His parents were pretty normal, with nothing adverse really noted anywhere about either one. Growing up, he liked playing rugby and running long distance. He did well enough that he even became the vice captain of the athletics department. When he was in high school, his mother was diagnosed with lung cancer, and the way that she would eventually pass away would become a huge contributing factor to who Harold would go on to become. Towards the end of her life, she would be given morphine to numb the pain. Harold would see her go from suffering to somewhat normal with each dose. On June 21st, 1963, she passed away in her home. Harold was there to see it. 3 years later, on November 5th, 1966, he would marry Primrose Oxtoby. They would go on to have 4 children. He went to school during this time to study medicine, and it said that he was very dedicated and focused on becoming a doctor. Without knowing who he ended up becoming, it seems honorable that he would pursue a career like this given the circumstances. He graduated in 1970 and was on to pursue his dream. In 1974, he took his first job as a general practitioner in the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center in West Yorkshire. Now, I probably pronounced all of that wrong, but I did my best. Pretty quickly in his role there, suspicion began to arise after it was noticed that a very large amount of the drug pethidine was being used. Pethidine is Demerol for those of you in the United States, and is a synthetic opioid pain medication. Originally, it was overlooked as his peers thought of him as an outstanding doctor and not someone who would do anything out of the normal. But when suspicions arose again, it was discovered that he was forging prescriptions of that drug and using it himself. He was forced out of the practice and fined 600 euros, which is around 2,100 euros in today's money, or 2,300 US dollars. That seems like an unfairly low amount to pay for that offense, but this was the 70s and things were a little different then and there. He spent around 30 days in rehab, and then in 1977 became a general practitioner again at Donnybrook Medical Center in Manchester. It seems like that would be impossible to do, and I'm sure it would be by today's standards, but this was the 70s, and it was common knowledge at the time that this guy was very well respected and liked. He was apparently very open about his addiction when interviewing for this role and convinced them that he was a new and improved person, and he wouldn't do it again. He would eventually go on to open his own practice, and he started to accumulate new patients. He was so well liked amongst the elderly community that there was a very long waiting list to become a patient of his. He would do home visits and talk to his patients about life and current events, and created a sense of safety and trust with the people under his care. This would continue for several years, until March 1998, when Linda Reynolds of the Donnybrook Surgery Center spoke to the coroner of South Manchester District. An employee of the Frank Massey and Sons funeral parlor had spoken to her about Harold Shipman and the patients that ended up in their funeral home. After that conversation, Linda spoke to the coroner about the unusually high death rate coming from Shipman's practice. She also spoke about the fact that a large majority of them had been cremated. During this time, there existed certain forms that had to be signed off on in the event of a death that was discovered by an attending physician, and Shipman's practice had been requesting a lot of those to sign off on. The forms were a type of checks and balances so that if a doctor did not agree with the cause of death or the information provided, the death could be investigated further. The coroner brought it to the attention of the local authorities, but they could not provide sufficient evidence to move forward with any type of charges. In August of that same year, a taxi driver contacted the police stating that he suspected Dr. Shipman of murdering at least 21 people. He said that he regularly delivered patients to and from the practice and had noticed that he had dropped off seemingly healthy people who would end up dying soon after. On June 24, 1998, a woman named Kathleen Grundy was discovered dead at her home. The last person to see her alive was Shipman. He signed her death certificate with, quote, old age being listed as a cause of death. All seemed normal until her daughter and lawyer, Angela Woodruff, was informed that her mother's will had been edited before her death to exclude her and her family from any benefits that she would have received. This was obviously a huge red flag, as she had been the primary beneficiary before the edit. It was found that the will was changed to include a benefit of £386,000 paid directly to Harold Shipman. She reported this to the police, who immediately investigated. They suspected foul play and exhumed Kathleen's body. They discovered traces of diamorphine, which is heroin, in her system. That drug is typically used for pain in terminal cancer patients. When questioned, Shipman said that she was an addict, even showing them old notes that he had written about her in his journal. But further investigation proved that the notes had been written after her death. In a search of his house, it was discovered that he had forged Kathleen's will with a typewriter that he had recently purchased. He was arrested on September 7, 1998. After his arrest, police looked into other recent deaths of patients in his care. They discovered 15 similar instances where patients had been dosed with lethal amounts of diamorphine, as well as backdated journal entries indicating that they had been in poor health the entire time. In October of 1999, his trials began. He was tried separately for some of the 15 alleged victims. He claimed that he was not guilty, but failed to prove that in any way. On January 31st of the year 2000, he was found guilty on 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and the judge recommended that he never be released. On February 11th, the General Medical Council removed him from their register. Behind bars, Shipman continually denied any wrongdoing and never admitted anything. In January the next year, an investigation was launched into several other deaths related to Shipman's practice. After this investigation was concluded, it was discovered that Harold Shipman was personally responsible for at least 215 deaths from 1975 to 1998. It was admitted that several other deaths were deemed very suspicious, but due to lack of evidence or cremation of the victims, they couldn't say with certainty whether or not he killed them. In total, 459 people died in his care while he was practicing medicine. Authorities estimate that 250 of them were intentional killings. It's rumored that some of his victims were younger, but the majority of them were older women who were in seemingly good health right up until their death. 6 other doctors were charged with misconduct in the killings but were later acquitted. Authorities cited that they should have known something wasn't right and should have seen what he was doing. On January 13, 2004, one day before his 58th birthday, he hung himself in his jail cell. He was pronounced dead at 8:10 a.m. He tied the bed sheets up to his cell window, according to prison staff, and hung himself. It was rumored that he committed suicide so that his wife would receive a life insurance settlement from his pension. This seems pretty obvious, as she did receive that money after his death. The news of his death was bittersweet according to most sources. Most people wanted him dead, but they also wanted some type of closure. In 2005, police discovered roughly 10,000 euros worth of jewelry in Shipman's garage that they think that he stole from his victims as trophies. His wife identified some of it as hers, but a lot of it wasn't. Police tried to return it to the victims' families, but were only able to return one item and auction off the rest. A memorial garden called the Garden of Tranquility was created to remember his victims and was opened in 2005 as well. Harold Shipman is the only doctor in British history to be found guilty of murdering his patients. His actions led to a huge reform in the way that death certificate practices went, as well as medicine distribution. There's actually something called the Shipman effect that happened around the time where doctors were so afraid of overprescribing pain medications that they actually underprescribed them. It's theorized that killing patients the way that he did was his way of regaining control that he lost when his mother died in the same way. I feel that all murders are about control and power, but it does make sense. Others speculate that he traded his addiction to drugs for the addiction of watching other people die from the drugs instead. Unfortunately, we will never know what his true motive was since he took that with him. I'm very sure that Harold Shipman is not the only doctor that's done this, and I'm sure that it's happening right now somewhere. Some people think that this specific case brings up the questions we have as a society about the morality of assisted suicide. But I don't think any of his victims were in that category though, as they were seemingly healthy older women. What do you think? Let me know by commenting on any of the posts or email me directly at tmpodcast19@gmail.com. If you'd like to decide what content that I cover or would like to just help support the show, head on over to patreon.com/thetmpodcast and become a patron. Thank you for listening to the TM Podcast.